Welcome to Memories for the People. I'm George Farrar. In 1968, Norman Rockwell painted this portrait of Ronald Reagan when he was governor of California. Of course, we know that Ronald Reagan would ultimately become the 40th President of the United States. It is my pleasure today to bring to you on Memories for the People memories that I have of President Reagan and what he accomplished for the country. And on April 25th, 2024, I had the opportunity to visit the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library and Museum in Simi Valley, California. And so what I'll be bringing you today are photos that I took that are exclusively from the museum of his presidency. So these are exhibits and images from the museum. America's best days are yet to come. Our proudest moments are yet to be. Our most glorious achievements are just ahead. Ronald Reagan had an eternal optimism to himself that he was able to communicate. People called him the great communicator, and indeed he was. His presidency spanned a lot of my childhood in the 1980s. Now, when he was running for office in 1980, the American and global situation was really tough. What you're seeing right there is an unemployment line. There was something called stagflation, a stagnant economy, but lots of inflation. We had gone through a series of presidents, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, and Ford, and Carter. And we had the Soviet Union. We had the Cold War going on. We had West Berlin and East Berlin, with Berlin and Germany itself being split between free and oppressed peoples. One of the greatest accomplishments President Reagan, and we'll see this, had was putting us on the path towards the fall of communism by standing and talking tough, but being willing to communicate, being willing to talk. And we had a lot going on in the late 70s and the early 80s. I can remember seeing Ayatollah Khomeini on television. I can remember the early years of the Reagan presidency. When he ran, he said, "Are you better off than you were 4 years ago?" We were surrounded in some cases. We had Fidel Castro in Cuba. Out in Libya, there was Muammar Gaddafi. Terrorism was around. And so much so that as he was running for president, there were hostages that had been taken in Iran. And so we had a lot of terrorism going on where planes were being hijacked. And this would carry on even through his administration. There's Yasser Arafat. He wouldn't renounce terrorism until the late 1980s. Here we see a painting of a parade in Washington, D.C., celebrating the return of the hostages from Iran, which he had announced their release shortly after his inauguration on January 20th, 1981. Now, we have these early months. He's taking office as president. But then, on March 30th, 1981, there's a very, very turbulent day. And we see a schedule here, and presidents are put on a very tight schedule, down to the minute, where they are and where they're going. Around 9 o'clock on March 30th, 1981, he met with his top advisors. He then was speaking with the Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany, Helmut Schmidt. Later on, he was talking to more advisors, including his press secretary, James Brady. So he had a lot of different conversations, and then ultimately in the early afternoon, he went out to the Washington Hilton in a motorcade. He went to speak to a labor group. At 2:24 p.m. Eastern Time, he returned to his motorcade, and he was shot by John Hinckley Jr. And James Brady was shot, and a Secret Service agent was shot, and I believe a police officer was shot at. And we see that the schedule fell apart. question marks everywhere. The president met with the First Lady. There's an apocryphal story, I believe this to be true, that Speaker Tip O'Neill visited President Reagan in the hospital, and when he did so, he got on his knees and encouraged people to pray. Okay? Now that is bipartisanship right there. These were different times. This was the 1980s. He had a very sunny optimism. He projected a beauty about the American experience. And for a child watching on television, he said, well, there's the president. And they would say, well, there's the president's going to talk tonight. He always seemed to have a smile on his face. He always seemed to be able to reach out to people and speak to them in terms that they understood. Now, later on, I would not always agree with his policies. But I know that President Ronald Reagan and certainly First Lady Nancy Reagan loved our country very much. She was very much, First Lady Nancy Reagan was very much a believer in the Just Say No movement against drugs. I remember having a Just Say No button in the 6th grade that I would wear. For me, it was just, wow, okay, yeah, sure. I wasn't exposed. Lived a very sheltered life, so I was somewhat not as exposed to what was going on. But I can remember in November 1984, in the living room with my stepmother's parents, watching his landslide victory in 1984, watching it on CBS Evening News, being hosted by Dan Rather, and being intrigued, being just amazed that Ronald Reagan won the electoral vote in such a massive way. And I mean, he carried states all over except for the state of Minnesota and the District of Columbia, which of course is not officially a state. So in his second term, he had an opportunity. In the early 80s, the Soviet Union had a series of leaders who were dying. Brezhnev had served a long time and died, and Andropov served briefly and died. Chernenko served briefly and died. He met with Mikhail Gorbachev at Geneva, and they would have these talks, these back and forth meetings. I would watch them on television because I was kind of impressed, and I'll tell you why shortly, what really caught my eye. But you have to imagine at this point, Germany is split between free and oppressed people, East Germany and West Germany. There are all these nuclear missiles everywhere, as there are still today. They were trying to get a handle on things. There was a lot of concern in the early 80s. There had been a Korean airliner that had been shot down. A lot of people died. There's terrorism in the Middle East. The good thing was that though we can look at Reagan as the ultimate Cold Warrior, people were really rattled by his foreign policy beliefs and some of the things he would say, calling the Soviet Union an evil empire and things like that. But he was always willing to talk and ultimately to negotiate. And, there was, at a certain point, there was the Reykjavik summit, and that was ultimately, after the Reykjavik summit, things really began to roll, because ultimately Reagan wanted to keep his Star Wars initiative, and he stood tough against the Soviets in preservation of that, at least that concept. The idea of Star Wars being this protective barrier to prevent attack by missiles, that he would have shared the technology, but never reached fruition. But he had the ability to go out to Moscow and to stand there talking with them. In January 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded. It was a traumatic event for many in Generation X. That was kind of like one of the most tragic events. The astronauts, 7 astronauts, died in this explosion shortly after liftoff. I lived in Florida. I had visited Kennedy Space Center the prior November. I was really shaken up. A lot of people were. We watched a lot of television in our classrooms that day. One of the astronauts was actually a teacher, Christian McAuliffe. I believe that the speech that President Ronald Reagan gave was probably one of the greatest tributes ever given to Americans. I believe it to be one of the greatest tributes to Americans I ever saw a president give. And I believe it goes down, along with Gettysburg and various other high-profile speeches, being one of the greatest speeches. He spoke from the heart. and he spoke from the pain in his heart, of Nancy's heart, and really reached out to the country on that day. While I was at the Library Museum, I had the opportunity to go into the Air Force One Pavilion, which is a really incredible place within the Library Museum. You get this opportunity in this huge space to see the Air Force One that flew presidents from 1973 up to 2001. So what an amazing span of American history that was. And I actually got a chance to go on board Air Force One. And so it was really incredible. And so you can see these huge windows with great views of the valley, and you get a unique experience to look up at Air Force One. And there are all these other exhibits as well. So, this gives you kind of also an understanding of the important role that travel has in a presidency. And President Ronald Reagan would fly all over the world, as other presidents have, in diplomatic initiatives, and then also, of course, flying throughout the country, through the United States, around the United States. And so, while there, I had the opportunity to go on board. And so you kind of like get in a line, and then, they'll take a picture of you outside, and you'll see a picture of me at the end of our show today. And then you get the unique experience of being able to go inside what was Air Force One at that time, and you kind of get to see it. I mean, in a plane, things are somewhat more cozy. They have desks and chairs and things like that. And back then, you have to keep in mind that this was the 1970s and 1980s. Later on into the 1990s, of course, the focus being on Reagan's times on the plane, with pictures that are hung up as well for you to take a look and get some context of these rooms, these special little places. And so a unique thing, really kind of it was actually, I consider it to be the height, one of the heights of my entire trip. And then you get a chance to see people, would type on a typewriter, you would type, and it would be a typewriter, and there was a touch-tone telephones and things like that to communicate with people. And then you get back out on the plane, and I had a chance to take a look at a Marine One helicopter that he would have flown. And then you get a chance, and here's where I kind of get back to the summit, the limo. That was really intrigued me, because remember, as a youngster, during his presidency, you'd see the cops and all the security people and the Secret Service agents with the little earphones, and everybody's running around the car, and the sirens are going, and so you're going like, oh man, there's the president. He's in this really nice limousine, and of course it's bulletproof and everything, and so you go, wow, that's kind of cool. So I really enjoyed that. That actually that was a really incredible experience. If you're ever in Southern California, no matter how you feel about politics, especially for those of you out there who have kids and you want to kind of give them at least a look at American history, they would just love this area of the museum. Real cool. They made a very good effort with this. And I actually remember at one point there was I watched a media event on television that was broadcast from here. So kind of a unique place. Speaking of unique places, one of the best spots to end the tour is this view of an old segment of the Berlin Wall that had been torn down after his presidency ended. You can reflect and think about things you can be proud of, and certainly you can be thankful for the fact that we had Ronald Reagan, that we got through the 80s in one piece, that the world got through the 80s in one piece. In the late 70s, early 1980s, things looked rather bleak so far as relations and so far as the future, both domestically and in foreign affairs. And while I voted Democrat in every presidential election since 1996, but it's the beauty of this country that you can go to a beautiful Presidential Library and Museum and enjoy it, and enjoy the exhibits and appreciate the history, and still have your own thoughts and beliefs about things. And at least I think the greatest thing we can acknowledge about President Ronald Reagan and Nancy Reagan was that they were probably the most beautiful, most optimistic, positive people to have occupied the White House with such love of country in that time period. Just an incredible experience that I had. So I wish you goodbye, and I thank you for watching. Take it easy. See you later.